Final Mile podcast on realagriculture.com is brought to you by Results-Driven Agriculture Research. Find out more by going to ardar.ca. Shaun Haney here with Real Agriculture, and welcome to another episode of the Final Mile podcast brought to you by Ardar. Today we're going to talk about the state of bees and pollinators in the province of Alberta, and we have two really strong experts on that topic. Up first, what I want to do is introduce both our guests. First, we have Connie Phillips. She's Executive Director with the Alberta Beekeepers Commission. Connie, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Shaun. It's great to be here.
Also joining us from the University of Lethbridge, she's an Ardar professor, associate professor at as I mentioned, at the University of Lethbridge. It is Dr. Shelley Hoover. Dr. Hoover, great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Shaun.
Okay, Connie, before we get started, tell me a little bit about who the Alberta Beekeeper Commission represents.
The Alberta Beekeepers Commission represents the commercial beekeeping industry in the province. So overall, this year, we have 155 beekeepers registered with the commission, and those 155 beekeepers manage 300,000 colonies across the province. The role of the commission is to provide programs, we fund research, we advocate, we develop tools for the beekeepers to use to help them be successful, perhaps not entirely with their businesses, but in a kind of more advocacy. We're going to help fund research and that type of stuff. So the producers that we represent actually own the commission, and they direct the board on what their priorities are.
Now, Shelley, I guess before we get into your academic perspective, talk about some of the research that you do there at the University of Lethbridge.
So we've, over the years, done research on many different things on a number of different bees. We primarily do work on managed bees. So we've worked on bumblebees, we've worked on leafcutter bees. But our primary focus, I would say, is definitely honeybees. And we've done everything from selective breeding for disease resistance to behavior, so effects of parasites and pathogens on behavior, the whole gamut, really.
I guess give us a state of the union here. What is the state of the pollinators in the province of Alberta?
That's a great question. I think that looking back over the last 10 years or so, we've seen a progressive increase in overwintering losses. And so comparing a 5-year time frame from 2012 to 2017, beekeepers were losing about 18% of their colonies. And currently they're losing, on average, about 40% of their colonies. So there's been a significant increase in overwintering losses. And there's a number of factors that contribute to that, which Shelley can elaborate more on, but related to environment, weather, disease pressures, agronomic practices for crop fields, and those kinds of things are tending to pressure bees and bee health overall.
Now, we heard here Connie talk about some of the issues and some of the losses. Do these things happen in cycles? Is this normal? Have we seen this before, or is there something different that's happening here when we look at some of the losses?
So first, I think we need to take a step back because your question was about pollinators. And so, of course, honeybees are just one species of bee that has been introduced from Europe. We have over 300 species of native bee alone, and never mind the other non-bee pollinators. And so I think we need to make it clear that we're speaking specifically about honeybees.
Okay.
And there is an element of truth, I think, to your question that sometimes these things cycle through populations just like they do in human health, right? We'll hear it was a bad flu year, or it was a good flu year, depending on the variant of the particular pathogen. But I think what's worrisome is that this is an ongoing trend of increasing mortality. So it's not just, one bad year. It's repeatedly bad years, and it's getting worse over time.
And Shelley, for some of the audience here, they're like, okay, there's been a lot more attention on bee health and the importance of pollination, but maybe from your perspective, why is this important? And why should people, why should people care and maybe put this up the ladder in terms of priorities to be dealt with?
Yeah, I guess there's two ways that I like to think about it. One that, I mean, anybody who eats should care about bees, right? Because bees pollinate the food that we eat. So so bees pollinate about three-quarters of all crop species. So the yield of those species benefits, about three-quarters of crop species benefits from the action of bees. And there are many, many crops that are staple crops that don't require bees. So things like potatoes, rice, corn, all of those foods that are beige and boring don't require bee pollination. But all the foods that are nutritious or delicious or provide a good profit for farmers, those are the ones that are pollinated by bees. So think about nuts, coffee, chocolate, fruits, vegetables. And it extends beyond the crops themselves. So even things like beef production is dependent on forage for the beef, right? And the seed for those forage plants is pollinated by bees. So even beef and dairy and cotton, all of these crops have their yield, at least in part, augmented by bees. And so here in Canada, we're quite fortunate. We Most Canadians don't struggle with adequate nutrition, but there's huge swaths of the world where this yield directly impacts people's ability to get nutrition. Here in Canada, it's obvious when you see, so for example, a crop failure in tree fruits or blueberries, that impacts directly the prices that we pay at the supermarket.
Colony, or sorry, edit that. Sorry, Colony and Connie together. Sorry about that. Connie, when you hear what Shelley's saying there, how are pollinators and beekeepers, I guess maybe more specifically, how are they reacting to some of these challenges?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think it's kind of a mix across the industry. The it seems like it should be obvious that the trending towards increasing losses also there's a concomitant increase in cost of production. So when you lose colonies, say 40% of your colonies, those bees have to be replaced in some way, and there's a couple different ways to do it. And we might get into this a bit later on, but one is importing packages from outside North America, and the other is a beekeeper can split their bees. But if they've lost, say we have a beekeeper with 10,000 colonies and they lose 40% of those bees, 4,000, the cost of replacing 4,000 colonies runs roughly about $400 per colony, so 1.6 million. They do it by packages. That's fairly a quick way. You buy a package, it insert it in your box and add a new queen and takes off right away. But if you're splitting, that's a slower process. And then that results, both those things result in lost honey production. So if we use an average of about 130 pounds per colony times $2 per pound, you get that loss on top of it. And right now, honey production and honey sales is the primary way that beekeepers make money. The other side of that is managing, as Shelley was describing the cycles, and you mentioned the cycles of disease. It's driven a change in hive management over the last 10 years, but the increase in cost of hive management has increased almost sixfold just in the 8 years I've worked for the commission. So approximately per year for a 7,000 colony operation, it might cost $60,000 a year now to treat bees through the year just to keep them healthy. So they're producing, they go into the winter healthier, hopefully, and then they come out better on the other side.
Can you frame this a little bit, Connie, from a perspective of the economics of it?
Well, the economics are tremendous. So if a beekeeper has to stop what he's doing and replace 4,000 colonies, he's losing not only honey production, which he might lose, it's for using our 10,000 colony business. he's losing $2 a pound. It's about a quarter of a million, or I can't do the math in my head, but I think I got to about 500,000 pounds was lost times $2 a pound. He's already right there lost
Yeah.
$1 million in revenue. And at the same time, if he has to spend 1.6 million to replace his bees, he's already in the hole. And when you're rebuilding, because in a overwintering loss, uh, something I learned from Shelley a long time ago, it's not all the bees that survive are in all as good as shape. So you might have some that are in fabulous shape, and those are the ones you would take and do splitting. But then you're taking your best bees, you're splitting them in two. You have to add a new queen, and every queen right now costs about $50. So you're adding the cost, another 200,000 to replacing those queens to that hole the beekeeper's in. And then he's sacrificing is kind of a strong word, but to get the best out of splitting and rebuilding, he's using his best colonies, and those best colonies would be the best producers, and he's slowed them down now by splitting them in half. So it's a real teeter-totter of trying to find the balance. And I've had, like, anecdotally, beekeepers say to me, I can lose up to 30% and recover if that's followed by 3 perfect years. But when is there ever 3 perfect years?
Yeah, that's a big if.
Yeah,
We're kind of moving into hope is not a plan territory
yeah.
there for sure. Shelley, I'd asked you about whether there was natural cycles to this, but I think we also should frame this in the sense of we've been talking about Alberta. It geographically, is this happening in a very broad sense, or is this quite are these losses localized?
No, they're definitely not localized. I mean, we do in any given year, you'll see sort of areas where the losses are worse, and that's probably likely in a large part to weather and to some extent to disease and the interaction with weather. But we're seeing the scale of losses across North America, and I would argue it's probably even more extreme in the US, in part because it's grown increasingly difficult to manage the varroa mite, especially in the US. They have their mites developed resistance to some of the chemicals that we use to treat for mites earlier than ours did, and to a greater extent than ours did. But there's also elements of weather in it too, because they have a longer bee rearing season in the US where it's warmer. So that means they also have a longer mite and pathogen rearing season in the US where it's warmer. But similar sort of trends and disease and pathogen and pesticide pressures are observed globally.
Okay, so let's talk about the varroa mite. What does the varroa mite actually do to the bees, and are there any new developments in controlling the varroa mite back here in Alberta?
Is that for me?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
Sure.
go for it.
I'll start. Maybe Connie can jump in. So the first question, or the first part of your question, was what exactly is this thing? So I mean, this is a parasitic mite. If you look at the sort of size of a honeybee, it would be a fairly large mite. So think about a mite, a little parasite attached to you that's kind of the size of a maybe a saucer, or maybe a little larger than a saucer. So it's fairly significant. You can see it with the eye. And what they do is basically feed on the bee in various life stages. So they can feed on juvenile bees, and they can feed on adult bees, and they will eat sort of the fat body and maybe the hemolymph as well. So they're kind of like tiny little vampires hitching a ride on the bee, and they actually reproduce in the developing brood. So the young bees are being fed on before they're even hatching as adults.
There's an irony there where if you have healthy bees and they're producing a lot of brood, you're increasing your risk actually for varroa mite in your colony.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Connie. We've done a lot of research on how weather impacts various pathogens in a honeybee colony, and most of them, when the weather is poor, the pathogen increases. But with varroa mites, when the weather is poor, the mite, or when the weather is good, the mite increases, because good conditions for bees are good conditions for the pathogen. So we see the strong, productive colonies are the ones that crash in the fall because grown a lot of mites.
And so, what tools does the beekeeper have available to you? You mentioned resistance. That sounds very similar to some of the topics when we talk about trying to deal with weeds. Seems to be some common threads here. Uh, But what tools do producers have available to them?
Well,
Connie, you want to talk about?
I think the good news is just recently, Shelley's at 4 new tools that
Four
have
new tools
become
this year
available,
already.
just
Mhm.
approved by PMRA just in the last month. And that's great news for beekeepers. Um, I think the next step is beekeepers learning how to use them, incorporating the tools into their integrated management plan, and getting the best out of those tools in conjunction with other ones that are already in place.
And are those cost effective tools? Like like it's one thing to have a tool available to you, but it's another thing. Does it actually fit into the economics of what the beekeeper has to deal with?
I think the ones, and I think the ones that have been recently introduced are cost-effective tools. They've had a lot of work done. They've been trialed by beekeepers in the field. And through that trialing, I think in particular with the oxalic acid and glycerin on pads, beekeepers have actually come up with best ways to incorporate that into their management practices. That's not to say there aren't tools out there that are ridiculously expensive and beekeepers would never use them, right? So
Yeah. Now, Shelley, we talked about the varroa mite and some of its challenges, but there's another parasite that we need to have be aware of and have top of mind.
Yeah, there's a lot of buzz, if you'll excuse the pun, about the Tropolelaps mite, which is it's another genus of mites from Asia, and originally its primary host was Apis laboriosa and Apis dorsata, which are two other honeybee species that are found in Asia. But it is also able to parasitize Apis mellifera, which is the European honeybee species that is kept in North America. And it we've known about these mites for many decades, but recently it's sort of been expanding its geographic range, and it's not clear why. Part of it has to do with human moving bees around, but it's recently expanded into Europe, and so the risks that it's posing to North American beekeeping have increased because the wider its geographic range, the more likely it is to accidentally make it to North America through either shipping, it could be in a swarm on a container, or it could be introduced through trade in bee stock globally.
Connie, how I guess do you have anything to follow up on this one?
no, I think Shelley covered it really well. I think for beekeepers and our provincial apiculturists, there's a lot of conversation across the country and concern, as Shelley said. It's been introduced. We know now Tropolelaps is in Europe. I think that we do import bee packages and queens from one of the European countries, and so there's been a lot of concern raised in that regard. And I think I feel like we're in the storming and forming stage where there's a lot of conversation. I'm sure that there's a lot of planning being done, but there's not a lot of outward communication right now. So I'm sure you can imagine what the beekeepers all like to talk to each other, and so they're having their conversations, and I just think we're at the beginning of this and trying to understand. And I think the other piece that's of a concern is the things that work to manage or control varroa to some extent. Not all of those work to control tropolalaps.
Okay.
And the other big concern for beekeepers is that tropolalaps can cause, our understanding currently, can cause a colony to collapse in a very short time, like 60 days. And and it's harder to detect because it's much smaller.
Need to be on
So
top of it.
yeah, so those are, I think, Canada and the United States, because we do share that common border, and bees are flying back and forth across the border without passports. It's shocking, but I think that there's concern on both sides of the border for the tropicalaps mite, and in an ideal world, you would want to prevent it from arriving in Canada or the United States at all. But knowing it sounds like it may be inevitable, that's what I hear from beekeepers, is that we need to be prepared for that. So there's a lot of work going on in that regard.
Shelley, is are there any biological controls like beneficials that attack these different types of parasites?
Yeah, so I mean the problem, of course, with controlling a mite on a bee is that you're trying to kill an arthropod on an arthropod very closely related. So what's likely to harm one is likely to harm the other. And the other confound is that you have to do it in a food safe way. So this is actually a very tricky question entomologically. Um, there have been some attempts in the past to look at sort of, natural enemies, but there's been nothing that's been effective in the colony setting. And we see that over and over again with research where something looks promising in the lab, but when you try and actually deliver it in a honeybee colony, it's not necessarily as effective as we would like.
Now, Connie, you had mentioned cross border. So let's talk about that a little bit here. Now, regarding bee imports, my understanding is that Canada has, for a while, long restricted the import of honeybees from the U.S. And some other countries. I guess right off the top, for people that aren't living in this space, why do we need to import bees at all if there's
Well,
some of these
going back
concerns?
to, well, there's a bit of history there. So prior to the border closing between Canada and the United States, beekeepers were importing about 230,000 colonies every year out of the United States into Canada. And part of the reason for that, again, going all the way back to weather, overwintering bees is difficult. So they would at, pre 1990 or 1987 import bees out of the United States. So when the border closed, um, I think the first logical thought was, okay, we need to find somewhere else to import bees from. And I think the first in line were Australia and New Zealand. I actually talked to one of my beekeepers yesterday, and he told me this crazy story of, well, first importing bees from Australia and the United States, or sorry, Australia and New Zealand. I mean, I don't know if you've flown to Australia or New Zealand, but it's a 13-hour trip. So the bees fly from, and way back then, like 25 years ago, or even 35 years ago, bees are flying on a plane. Bees generate a lot of heat, a lot of carbon dioxide, and they often would arrive in Vancouver dead. So it was the first 10 years or so of importing from the other side of the world in the southern hemisphere were a disaster. So what beekeepers were doing, and I thought this would be a great book, is actually they were smuggling bees, and they were smuggling bees and queens into the country, and you can appreciate why they would be doing that because they were just trying to survive. And it made me think of many years ago when the wheat board
Mm.
was a big issue for barley growers, and they were driving their bee trains across the border anyways. Come back, get arrested, and then go home and do it the next day. So producers, whether they're beekeepers or crop growers, need to make a living. And so that's what they were doing. A lot of the wrinkles in shipping bees long distances have been sorted out. Um, However, it's not without bumps. During COVID, because airlines weren't flying, no bees were being shipped in. So, but the point, maybe back to your question of importing bees, is replacement for lost stock. But overall, importations now, there's four approved countries, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and Italy for packages, and the United States, Northern California, and Hawaii to import queens. So, but the importation of packages, if you think now we're losing 40% of our bees, nationally that would be over 300,000 colonies that are lost every year. We only bring in about 60,000
Wow.
packages. So it's barely a drop in the bucket. And some of the biggest uh, the biggest market for these packages is really the hobby side of the industry. And so it's really questionable if importing packages is making a difference over the long term for the commercial beekeeping industry.
So, do,
And
so
I,
do the current import rules need to change then, based on some of these loss numbers?
well, I, that's a good question, and I think difficult to answer. The import rules are in place for a number of reasons, and there's layers. So, starting with the World Organization for Animal Health, they set guidelines for these are high risk diseases and pests, and there's guidelines for how you assess that. Those guidelines are connected to trade agreements through the WTO. And so Canada is bound by those agreements. And in Canada, we have a Health of Animals Act, which guides decision making on importing or not, where it's safe to import from. And then even within the country, moving bees domestically, there's rules for moving bees from one side of the country to the other, just because of the differences regionally in weather and climate and those types of things. Different pests that might not survive in Alberta will survive in the southern mainland or in Ontario
Yeah.
down close to the border. So the controls are in place for biosecurity. Um, and we in for any livestock, it has to be considered from a safety perspective what's best for the industry, what's best to keep our herds or colonies alive over the long term. I think what we've seen with imports from far, far away is it's not working well for our bees here in the country. And so after 30 years, what I'm starting to hear from some of my beekeepers is this may not be a good plan and we need to come up with a different one and we need to develop our own stock. And we've seen a lot of success in Europe in doing that. So I think well, import controls are important. What's being allowed in isn't really working well, I don't think, for the entire industry. And um, we need to have a different plan. And Queens might be a bit of a different story. I'm not sure entirely. Shelley could
Yeah.
elaborate on when Queens were first allowed in and why that decision was made. And I think what has slowed down making a change that's best for the country is, ironically, being able to import queens has kept the industry alive. But again, we keep losing ground, so we need to have a different plan.
Yeah, well, I was just going to ask Shelley about this, and one of the questions we had was why can't we produce queens in Canada? So Shelley, nice segue there by Connie. So I'll pass it off to you to answer to fill some gaps here for us.
Yeah, so I think there's really two issues with regard to import. One is the import of packages or bulk bees to make up colonies, and the second is the importation of the queens themselves. And the reason that we continue to import queens, I would argue, is just simply weather. So if you're a beekeeper and you want to expand your number of colonies in the spring, which is when a beekeeper would want to do that, it's very difficult for us to rear and especially to get mated queens at that time of year. So in order to have a mated queen, you need to have mature drones. So we can't do that in April when a beekeeper might want queens. We can only do that sort of, I mean, maybe late April into May. So it's just simply a weather thing where we can't rear and mate queens as early as beekeepers might want them. The one thing that we can do, just it requires a shift in management. So we have really great mating conditions and weather and mature bees later in the season, say July and August. We can mate and make and mate great queens at that time of year and then basically pre-make them the year before. So if we're going to have, we know on average we're going to have 40% losses, we're going to need queens early in the spring. What we do is make them the season beforehand But that requires us to overwinter them, which is, of course, a financial and labor investment, and there's all kinds of issues associated with it. But you basically have to make up the alternative strategy to importing queens is to make up your losses the year before and then overwinter them so that you have them in the spring.
Doesn't seem like there's any easy answers here. Like as we go through this, that's I'm not living in the pollination business on a daily basis, but that's become very clear here in our discussion. No
If there was
easy,
an easy answer, the beekeepers would be doing it.
right, and we wouldn't need a whole bunch of research funding, right, and
We wouldn't be here right now.
yeah, and all that work to be done. Okay, so Connor, let's go back to you. We talked about the economics around the colony losses, but let's talk about the economics of things right now for members of your association, the beekeepers. And prices went down in 24, remained depressed in 25 because some of the production shortages. There's there's basically a demand for imports of honey into the country. How is all of this affecting Canadian honey producers, and why does this matter beyond just beekeeping from your perspective?
Well, first, Shaun, I'm going to disagree that we're not importing because we need honey in this country. We produce a lot of honey and could supply the entire country.
Okay.
I think that packers and blenders are importing because they can buy cheap honey. They can buy honey, say, I'm going to pick on one country. I don't know if I should do that. But just say Vietnamese honey gets shipped in here for like $1 or less than $1 a pound often.
Hmm.
Our beekeepers need between $2 and $2.50 just to break even.
Connie, that's a big difference.
That's huge. So if you're a packer or you're a food processor, not picking on them, I mean everybody has least cost formulations. I need to make money. Everybody's facing the same pressure. They're going to buy the cheapest honey they can get their hands on. There's that. So it isn't a matter of supply.
Okay.
Across the country. We don't need to import to meet demand domestically because we produce plenty. Alberta could supply Ontario and Quebec with no issue at all. So matter of it, and we're seeing this, maybe a shift will come with this change in interprovincial movement of food products that it'll be easier to ship Alberta honey into Eastern Canada, maybe. But there's still the pressure of the honey that can be brought into the country that's cheap. If you were a food processor or whoever, you're trying to make some money, even a honey packer, this sounds horrible. Honey packers they'll import syrup, blend it with honey, and sell it for the same price as pure Canadian honey on a retail shelf, but it costs them way less than it costs our producers to make it. There's a lot of pressure with honey's one of the most adulterated food products in the world. There's a lot of pressure on the Canadian market and our producers because at least 20% of the imports coming into this country has been tested by CFIA and is adulterated. So that honey can come in, and if it escapes being tested, then it can make it to a shelf. The other confounding issue with honey at the retail level is most consumers don't understand the words on the label. There's a big difference between product of Canada and made in Canada.
Right.
And product of Canada is 100% honey, Canadian honey. Made in Canada can be a blend of honey from anywhere in the world with Canadian honey. It's blended here and then sold. So there's a level of unfair competition for our producers who have to meet higher standards, not only in relation to CFIA, but this whole industry relies on temporary foreign workers. We have to maintain a very high standard in regard to their safety, their housing. There's just a higher level. Another kind of funny, not so funny situation is organic honey that gets shipped into the country, and we know the country shipping the organic honey in can't even possibly be producing that much. And somehow, without a recognized organic certification from that country, somehow it gets recognized as organic once it hits the market here. And so it's a gap in our regulatory system that's letting these things kind of slip through. So I I want to just emphasize we have plenty of honey to supply the domestic market. The volume of honey that's produced, it cycles, like we've talked about with bee health, because it
Yep.
cycles with the bee health. There's a trend in decline as there's a trend in decline of bee health, and
So,
that's something that we have to watch.
so are we exporting then?
We do export. Our largest export markets are Japan and the United States. In the last 4 years, we've flipped from being a net exporter to now we're a net importer. And just for the reasons I've just elaborated
Yeah.
on is the pressures coming in from cheap honey being readily available. The other challenge for beekeepers in selling their honey is Japan buyers now have don't want to buy honey that has any level of quinclorac, which is an herbicide used
Yep.
in the canola industry to manage cleavers. They won't buy honey if it has the maximum residue limits are set so low, it's impossible to meet it. So we've Alberta, anyways, has lost ground in the Japanese market, and I think looking east, Manitoba has picked up a bit of that. So overall, I think we're maintaining our Canadian honey to Japan, but Alberta has lost ground in that area.
Now, Shelley, we've been talking about honeybees and some of the trials and tribulations and some of the struggles and some of the things that need to be dealt with, but there there are other species in the pollinator system. Talk about how things like bumblebees and solitary bees, how are they faring? Are they facing some of these same challenges on the disease front and other things?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest difference is that we have beekeepers who can advocate for honeybees, whereas these hundreds of other species of native pollinators, many of them we just don't know. We don't even have enough information to understand their status and whether we should be worried or not. We know there are some bumblebee species where, they're listed. We have one that's listed as either endangered or critically imperiled, depending which list you look at. But many of these hundreds of species, we just lack sufficient data to know. I think it's probably very much like other types of wildlife where some of the species are doing just fine and some of the species are, facing things like habitat loss, parasites, pathogens, pesticides. It really depends on the species because when you're talking about 300 bees or species of bee, of course, some of them are very specialized, some of them are generalists, some of them have wide distributions, some of them have narrow distributions. So I think the short answer is that we just don't have enough information about most of those species, but also they don't have an industry behind them advocating for them. We have groups like conservation groups like the Alberta Native Bee Council that are doing their best, but they don't have the support to sort of advocate for all of these groups.
Where do leafcutters fit in all of this?
Leafcutter bees. So if we're talking the managed leafcutter bee species, it's also an introduced species from Europe. We do have native leafcutter bee species, but the one that's managed was also introduced from Europe. And of course, alfalfa seed producers grow leafcutter bees and manage them. They have their own sort of various disease and pathogen issues, but there is some overlap, especially in the viral pathogens that can affect those two groups. But they have, for example, their own version of chalk brood and their own version of parasitoids. They have a wasp that attacks them. And so one of their big issues right now is that the product they were previously using to control the wasp is no longer on the market, so they're looking for alternatives.
Yeah, farmers of all types
Yeah,
face these kinds of
exactly.
issues. Okay, so Canada recently approved the world's first honeybee vaccine for, make sure I'm saying this right, American full brood or
Foul
foul
brood.
brood.
Yeah.
How long before something like this could realistically change bee health in Alberta, Shelley?
I would say it's probably unlikely to change bee health in Alberta. It's another tool in the toolbox. I would argue that American foul brood is not, across the whole province are major problems. Certainly there are particular operations where there will be an outbreak, and it's a great tool in the toolbox for those specific operations. But broadly across, the province or across Canada, foul brood is not, American foul brood is not our sort of major fight right now. In terms of treating that disease, it's, as I said, it's another tool in the toolbox, but there are other ways to deal with that disease already, and so I think it's unlikely to sort of change the landscape of bee health.
Okay, so let's wind up here and sort of round this all together. We've heard a lot about the challenges that not only the bees themselves, the honeybees themselves face, but also the beekeepers from a production standpoint. For the average listener, maybe that's a farmer, a rancher, maybe that's somebody that lives in the city of Calgary. Do they have a role here? What can they do to support pollinators? Connie, I'll start with you.
I think that there's lots that can be done. I think we have to one distinguish between urban beekeeping, which there has a huge following across Alberta. I think we have 1,800 hobby beekeepers in different urban centers around the province. But commercial beekeeping is very different. And I think maybe the commission needs to expend a bit more energy and time on advocating into the general population and just an appreciation from bees. And I actually liked, I don't know who wrote the introduction, but that honeybees in particular are critical infrastructure to agriculture. And the point that Shelley's making, if you want to eat, we need bees. I think that the really common and popular notion of we need to save the bees is appreciated. But once someone says that, they don't really know then what. So, okay, but then what? And you can in your garden plant flowers, and that's terrific, and it supports probably in a larger way some of the native pollinators. But for the managed bees, I think there's a broader understanding that's needed even across other commodity groups and starting to work together to really appreciate the contribution that each makes to each other's success.
Shelley, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's definitely things an individual can do, but also broader as a society, things we need to do. So, number one, if you're an individual, buy your honey from an Alberta beekeeper, right? I don't want to call out specific companies and say buy from them, but
Yep.
buy from an Alberta beekeeper, identify that. And as Connie said, plant flowers. Especially, I was telling Connie, I always argue for trees and shrubs because per square meter of ground, they offer a lot of flowers, and they're also flowering at spring, which is a very important time for native and managed pollinators. I would also argue that as a society, we need to think about our priorities. So, like everything from crop breeders who sometimes maybe have focuses other than bees when they're breeding their crops to, what types and how much pesticides do we want to allow where to how do we manage our landscapes, right? What do we do in the verges, the roadside ditches? What do we do in parking lots? All of those things, I think, when you scale them up, can be impactful for both managed and native pollinators.
So to wrap up, the title of this podcast is the final mile, and so I'd like to hear from both of you on this topic of bees in general. and pollinators. What needs to happen in that final mile from your perspective? Shelley, we'll start with you.
Start with Connie.
Okay, Connie, you're up.
Wait, I was going to say start with Shelley.
No, you were voluntold. You were voluntold.
Um, Gosh, you know what, that's a great question. And uh, I think, and I think in Alberta this happens really well. But as we've talked about, this is not just an Alberta issue, but it's a global issue. And we have bees flying back and forth across the border. And something that we have done in the final mile is the two national bee organizations in Canada and the two of the national bee organizations in the United States have gotten together and they've developed a North American bee strategy.
Mm.
And I think it's about conversations. And we work with a group in the United States called the Honeybee Health Coalition. They work with us. We're starting to collaborate on things like if the Environmental Protection Agency has approved a new tool, it should speed up the approval in Canada through PMRA. So to begin to align those things so that at least in North America, where bee health is affected in both countries, um, not exactly the same, but we usually see if the US has had a big loss, generally we'll see a big loss in the next 2 or 3 years. So I think that on a final mile, that coordinating that work, and I know that researchers like Shelley are connected throughout globally to the work that's going on around the world. I really like it in Alberta that our beekeepers are really generous with their time and their bees
Mm.
in supporting research in the field and often at great risk and risk of loss of all the bees in the field. So I think we have a good research ecosystem in Alberta to get what we're learning to the final mile. And the other maybe little additive that the commission has done in the last 5 years is we've launched a technology transfer program, and one of their jobs is extension and education. And so they'll take research that's been done, say at U of A, and they'll have to translate it so it makes it more accessible for for the beekeepers, as well as going out to the field and working directly with the beekeepers to help resolve their problem. So I do feel like in that final mile space, we do have a good ecosystem there. I think there are disconnects, maybe as Shelley mentioned, with crop breeding. And I pester Ardar all the time about this. It's when you're approving new crop varieties, you should always ask, is this going to harm bees or help bees? Because it matters in the end. We've seen new varieties that do better when it's really hot or there's drought, but then there's no forage for the bees. So the plant's good, but the bees are not. So we have to find a way to bring that ecosystem on those sides together instead of just worrying about are the bees healthy. They're healthy if the crops are healthy and the crops are feeding the bees. And the same as Shelley mentioned quite a while ago with even feeding cattle and the quality of the forage the cattle are getting. So we need to integrate these things a little bit better, and that would support the final mile.
There you go. Yeah, Shelley, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Connie touched on a lot of the same ideas as I was thinking. I think we do have a very good research environment in Alberta in terms of, the researchers all get along well with another. There's synergies there. We get along with the beekeepers. We talk to beekeepers. I can phone up a number of beekeepers in my region and talk to them, and I do, and I listen to their problems, and I think that's very important. But I agree with Connie that we need to do a better job of integrating with the rest of agriculture. So, for example, Connie gave a couple examples, but for example, if you're, breeding a variety of canola that's tolerant to increased levels of glyphosate, they don't even think of bees. But that's a huge, important factor for someone trying to sell honey that's coming off that crop. If it's got more glyphosate in it, potentially it might render it unmarketable for that producer. Or things like when the sugar beet factory suddenly switches from using beet sugar to cane sugar, that impacts the honeybees, but they don't think of the downstream effects on bees for these things. So I think that is probably one area that we do need to do better, is reaching out to these other areas of agriculture.
Great stuff. Well, I appreciate both of you joining us here for this episode of The Final Mile presented by Ardar. All the best to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shaun.
The Final Mile podcast on realagriculture.com is brought to you by Results Driven Agriculture Research. Find out more by going to ardar.ca.